when they don't have work, so that you can tide over that period of lockdown. In India, 95% of our workers are informal. They have no social protection, almost zero social protection. And so if you actually shut down an economy and prevent people from working, you are depriving them of their livelihood and income. So the first is that we did a containment strategy that was not suited. And it turns out it was not very effective in containing the virus either. The other aspects of it, physical distancing. I cannot use the term social distancing because I believe it's a terrible concept, and it just reminds me of caste, which we are very good at. Physical distancing is again an idea that works in developed countries where people have houses that are large enough to maintain distance, where workplaces are not also very crowded, where there's not a lot of informal activity that is necessarily clustered. But in India, 40% of our urban population and about a quarter of our village population, they live in very, very congested, crowded slums or very small houses or rooms with many people in a room, very little in terms of even the capacity for maintaining a distance. Many people, urban areas and rural areas don't have water. It has to be fetched over long distances, carried and stored. And to then say, do the physical distancing of 3 meters apart whenever you're meeting other people, wash your hands all the time with soap and water. These don't mean anything. People cannot do that. So it was completely unsuited to the requirements and the living conditions, the lived reality of our people. This brutal lockdown, in turn, would have made sense if the government had used that time to actually somehow build up the preparedness for this dealing with this disease. And of course, that's the purpose of a lockdown. It is to buy time. It doesn't make the virus go away. It's simply reducing the possibility of infection so that in the meantime, you take these other measures to be prepared. Now, what are those measures? You have to make sure you have enough medical personnel, health workers of all kinds. You have to make sure they have proper equipment. You have to make sure there are enough hospital beds, doctors, nurses. You have to make sure that we have the medical tests to find out who has the virus and the capacity for then tracing the contacts, isolating people, treating them, and so on. You have to make sure you have enough ventilators. I mean, there are all of these things that you have to put in place. However, we did not use the lockdown to put this in place. We basically did a lockdown and said, okay, now after 21 days, we will thali bajao, diya jalao, and the virus will go away, which of course did not happen. Now, this reflects another, I would say, very, very problematic feature of the government's involvement, which is that it was a peculiar form of centralization without coordination. The government used the Disaster Management Act, which gives it supreme powers. It can override every rule, every law, every state government decision, every other public entity's decision. The Disaster Management Act is a very, very overriding, centralizing act. The Prime Minister is the head of the National Disaster Management Authority. So basically, the central government gave itself complete powers, and then it didn't use them. So it centralized all the power into itself, and then it told the state governments, you're on your own. Now you solve the problem, you deal with it. Effectively, every state government was left to manage to deal with this however they could. And that led to all kinds of problems. One state border is closed and while the other side is open. Somebody has, there was a complete lack of coordination. And that's the opposite of what is intended by the Disaster Management Act. The worst aspect of this centralization is that the central government did not even make available sufficient resources. So the state governments were literally left holding the double babies of the dealing with the pandemic and dealing with the economic collapse. And the central government did not give them enough resources to manage this. So Kerala had estimated it would take them 20,000 crore to actually deal with the fallout of this virus and to provide adequate social protection and to make sure that too many livelihoods were not destroyed by this. The central government makes available out of that small little fund that it creates, how much out of 20,000 crore? 146 crore. This is the kind of parsimony that we are seeing in terms of not allowing state governments even the basic fiscal resources. It is so extreme that the central government owes the state governments the GST compensation fund. As you know, that there was deal signed and it is legal. The central government promised to give the state governments compensation for any shortfall in GST revenues below 14% growth every year. They owed the state governments 40,000 at the beginning of January. They did not pay this until June. So they actually delayed paying at a time when the state governments were desperate for money because they were the ones doing all of this work. And that also affected the ability of these state governments to do anything. Of course, many of the crises that we saw, these crises of the migrants walking, the terrible, the mess on the railways when the trains were finally allowed, the fact that some buses were running across state borders, some were not, people were made to wait at these borders, there was inadequate relief when they got somewhere, all of these can also be traced to this. Now, the wrong timing of the lockdown is also another reason why we now have more cases, surprisingly. You see, if you're locked down when there are very few cases and you pretty much know where they are, they were in 4 or 5 cities in the country, really, because it had come from abroad. And in the state of Kerala, because the cities and towns are more contiguous, it was a little bit more. But you knew where they were localized. By locking down the entire country and then not giving social protection, not giving any income to those who have been denied the possibility of earning their livelihoods, you are then forcing these people to stay on in their very unhealthy, very congested conditions, often in a lot of squalor, and it's getting worse and worse because you are not providing them any means of survival. So they first live on savings, then they borrow, and at some point even that runs out. They are desperate to go home, but you have stopped all transport with 4 hours notice, remember? You have stopped all public transport, all railways, all buses, all roads. You cannot be walking on the road. And yet people have nothing to do, no way to live. So they are desperate. The migrant workers, about 120 million is estimated, have come from rural to urban areas to work. They are without any recourse. There's not enough in terms of providing them food. There's not enough in terms of, let's say, even community kitchens and things like that, which would just allow them to keep living. Desperately, they try and go back home, and we know what happens then. We know the cruelty that happens to the migrant workers as they're somehow attempting to reach their homes, whether they are beaten or sprayed with dangerous chemicals and disinfectants, or have to travel in containers and cement mixers, or put into detention centers. The point is that they are all congregating. They are gathered together in railway stations. They're gathered together in places, desperate to try and go back. They're crowding up, then they're walking long distances, and then they're put into detention centers, which are also cramped and with very poor conditions. All of this is a recipe for spreading a disease where you did not have that disease, where you would not have spread it. If instead you had not done that lockdown, you had confined it to those areas where you had the disease, and then traced everybody who is moving from that place, and followed them and quarantined them, isolated them if they had any symptoms and so on, you would have contained it. This is how countries like Vietnam did it. This is how many other countries who have poorer conditions have managed to contain the virus. Even Thailand has managed to contain it much, much better than us. Although they have a global inflow of tourists and everything, even they have managed to contain it better because they didn't do this such complete thing. And then when it's getting worse, then you open up. So the worst lockdown, the most brutal lockdown, the first 6 weeks, occurs when there are fewer cases. And then as the cases multiply and grow and grow and grow, we now have the highest daily rate of infection in the world, higher than the US over the last 3 days. As these cases grow, you open up the economy because you have no choice, because now, people will starve to death and the entire country will be on their knees. So we have been opening up at a time when it is actually more dangerous to do so, and where people are more at risk. And so the entire thing has been stood on its head. The whole way of dealing with it has been so wrongly done that it's actually created even more of a problem and has added to the possibilities of infection. Now, these workers, these migrants who were gathering in hundreds of thousands in different places, desperate to go back, and then infecting each other possibly on the journey back and so on. Many of them have gone back to some of the poorest, least developed parts of our country, where there is nothing like medical infrastructure, where there is hardly a primary health center functional. Forget about having a special COVID sort of hospital. And so we are allowing this disease to spread to parts of the country which have really no capacity to deal with it. And we are not even aware of the extent to which it's spreading, because every state government is now desperate to reduce the number of deaths. You probably know, you have realized this, that every state government is doing all kinds of crazy contortions, not to call a death a COVID death, not to register cases because you don't test enough, not even to release the total number of deaths, because then people might start getting suspicious that why was there an excess. So overall, the country is being kept in the dark, and that's the worst way to contain it. It's actually a way to make it much, much worse. The public health authorities and all authorities have to know exactly what's going on and where is a hotspot and what is a problem. By suppressing it, we're actually making things much, much worse. Now, I've already talked about the fact that we don't, in general, as a system in the country, we don't have social protection. But the lack of it in this period was absolutely startling, because we need not have done it so badly. Take food. We actually have, one of the few things we have is a public distribution system for food, which is reasonably efficient. It reaches across the country. Now, we also have, at this point, and over the last 3 months, we've had a massive surplus of food grain stocks with the Food Corporation of India. Even before the Rabi harvest was collected, there were 77 million tons of food grain, wheat and rice. After the Rabi harvest collection, during this whole period, there has been also the Rabi harvest. It reached 110 million tons at one point. Even now, there is 100 million tons. The buffer stock requirement for the country is 24 million tons. Even now, we are holding 4 times the required level of food grain. We don't need to hold this. The central government could simply have issued this free, 10 kilograms per household free for 6 months, because there is immense hunger. We know there is immense hunger. We can see it around us, but we also get horrific stories of people who are now, whom somehow had managed for these months and now are really starving because they have run out of all possible sources of buying any food or of accessing food in any way. If we had allowed for 10 kilograms free for every household, we calculate that, let's say 80%, let's assume even 80% of the households in the country take it. What will that cost you? I'll tell you in a minute. Supposing you did that and you did the other thing which Professor Ramana raised, which is very important, social protection. I would call it in this case compensation. People have lost their wage incomes not because they said we won't work, because you prevented them from working. So you as the government, it's your responsibility to make sure they have enough to survive in this period when they cannot work. So we had said 7,000 rupees at least per household for 3 months. Maybe not 6, but 3 months at least during this lockdown period. It is your obligation. You are the ones who prevented them from working. Supposing you did both of these, that is, you provided food and you provided some minimal income for other basics. What would it have cost the government? 3.5% of GDP. Now that sounds like a lot, but actually it's not. It's not, because in fact this government will end up with a larger fiscal deficit simply because it hasn't spent the money. And I'll explain how that happens in a minute. But by not spending, it is actually creating the conditions for a larger fiscal deficit by the end of the year. If it had spent more, it would not have had such a larger deficit, because that spending would generate more economic activity. You see, what has happened now? All these people have lost incomes, everybody has stopped spending. Either they cannot afford to anymore, or they have run out of credit, or there's even the ones who have money, they're saying we're saving because we don't know what will happen. Maybe tomorrow I'll lose my job. Maybe my father will not have his job. Maybe I will not be able to go and work in so and so place. So anyone who can and who has access to some regular income is saving. And the ones who don't have access, obviously they cannot spend. So consumption has collapsed in our economy. Okay. Then will investors invest? Why would an industrialist who is not able to sell the goods that they have already, why will they invest to build capacity? They will not. So investors also, industrialists also, are saying we cannot. And so we're also waiting. So the only agency in the economy that can actually increase demand is the government. If the government went out and spent right now it would generate demand among people who are desperate. And I mean, of course, it would improve their welfare, but it would have a macroeconomic effect. It would have a multiplier effect. If you actually did a doubling of the employment guarantee in the urban areas and in the rural areas, that is, give 200 days of work instead of 100. If you brought in an urban employment guarantee, and the state of Jharkhand has just announced today that it is going to bring in an urban employment guarantee, so it can be done. Kerala has already started one as well. If you actually do more of these, you would generate more demand. And that demand has what we call a multiplier effect. You put money in the hands of a worker. He goes out and buys food, soap, whatever, clothes, buckets, whatever they need, medicines. He buys all of these things. The shopkeepers are able to sell these things. They demand more from the distributor. The distributor then eventually demands more from the producer. That is the multiplier effect of that spending. Each time you spend, you can actually generate a multiple of the income that the original spending involved. Now, this basic idea the government seems to have forgotten. And instead, what is it doing? It's cutting down on a lot of its own spending. The amount of relief offered has been pathetic. The first relief package that the finance minister announced came to about 0.7% of GDP. Nothing. Subsequently, there was a very major announcement, Atmanirbhar Bharat, 20 lakh crore, amounting to 10% of GDP, according to the Prime Minister's speech. But then when you actually sat and looked at the details, what was the new spending? Tiny. So the total new spending of the government comes to about 1.3, 1.4% of GDP at most. That's the new spending they have announced. What is all the rest of this big 20 lakh crore? It's all either things in the future or it is credit. And that to the credit, not that I'm giving you today, it is that I will allow banks to extend credit by this much, which is not the same thing at all. Again, banks are reluctant to give credit to medium, small enterprises because they don't think these enterprises will be viable. They won't last. That's one problem. But also, many enterprises are not willing to borrow right now or able to borrow. The ones that do need it just to tide over this period, somehow, they are also not able to access because the banks are still wary. So they're holding on to whatever cash they've got and then they will see later on. So it's not working. That strategy is not working of using the supply side. Deregulation, that's the other big story that they do. That we will actually do deregulation and that will allow lots of investment to come in. That really does not work. You know, when China and US had a trade war, and everybody thought that, okay, good, now a lot of foreign investment that used to go to China will come to India. But that happened from 2 years, it's been happening. And a lot of multinationals have actually reduced investment in China or are trying to find other locations. But where have they gone? Not India. There's only one project that has come to India, one small Apple factory, tiny. Out of Apple's total global operations, it's a tiny, tiny percentage. Everything else went to Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines. All of them have higher wages, tighter labor regulations, tighter, not looser, tighter labor regulations, tighter environmental controls, all of them. So why did the companies go there? Because transport infrastructure is better, logistics is better, and it's better to have healthier, well-paid workers with proper housing. Employers find it easier to deal with those workers than to deal with very poor workers, underfed, in poor health conditions, in a desperate strait, which is what happens when you deregulate labor markets. So it's not just that it's very unfair and unjust and anti-worker, it's also stupid. It doesn't work. The other thing that I mentioned, the macroeconomic policy being stupid, let me just try and explain to you. It sounds counterintuitive, right? If I say that if they spent more today, they would have a lower fiscal deficit at the end of the year. But let me explain how this happens. If you spend, let's say this 3% of GDP today, then what happens is that generates more economic activity. So that, let's say you have spent 200,000 crore, okay? That will generate more economic activity depending on the multiplier. And the multiplier depends on how much people consume out of the money that they get. So in India, especially our workers tend to consume most of their income. So you will get very high multipliers of 4 or 5, usually it's estimated in India. Let's assume even not even that. Let's assume just even a multiplier of 3. So if you spend 200,000 crore, you actually will get 600,000 crore economic activity increase, right? And with that, you will generate more tax revenue, because the more economic activity there is, even if the direct tax fellows cheat and don't pay and do all that, indirect tax dominates our taxes today. And they have no choice but to pay that. A lot of that you end up paying. The poor end up paying more taxes than the rich, because most of their taxes are paid through indirect means. So you would generate more tax revenues. And so your final deficit would look less, because you would have brought back more tax revenues than you would have otherwise. Let's think of it the other way. Supposing the government decides, no, I have to keep my fiscal deficit down. And in the month of April, I got only 30% of the tax revenues I'm supposed to get. So I should be very careful now. I'm going to stop spending. I'm going to cut down on other spending. This is exactly what they are already doing. They have announced some packages, but they have told all the other ministries, now you have to cut back. You can't spend what you were spending because we don't have the resources. So this government is actually going to end up spending less than it had budgeted in its budget of that it was presented in February. I'm serious, I'm not joking. It will spend less than it had budgeted for in February. Why? Because its tax revenues will be lower. So then they will say, very good, I've got a lower fiscal deficit. But meanwhile, actually what will happen? Meanwhile, because you're spending less, the economy goes into a further spiral. It shrinks even more. It contracts at a faster rate than it would have if you had not spent. As it contracts, tax revenues also get even less than they would have. So in fact, your deficit is what? Is how much you spend minus your tax revenues. Your tax revenues are also, you're spending less, but your tax revenues are also falling. So your deficit level still remains large. And then people always look at the fiscal deficit as a ratio of your GDP. And your GDP is also lower. So you end up with a worse number than you would have if you had spent now and generated that demand and kept the economy afloat. Many governments across the world are realizing this. That's why many governments have spent much, much more than India. They have spent, the US has already about 13% of GDP, and they're expecting to have another stimulus in September. England, 14% of GDP. South Africa, about 6% of GDP. Brazil, 10% of GDP. Japan, 21% of GDP. This is the kind of a thing that they are spending. And in India, what is our fiscal expansion? 1.3% so far. And I am saying that is only what they have announced as the additional spending, but they haven't told us how much they're going to contract on the other spending. So we may end up actually with no real fiscal stimulus. This is macroeconomically a disaster. It is the stupidest thing you can do. Okay, now very quickly, because I want to leave some time for questions, let me also then talk about some of the other things that were wrongly done. One is the whole emphasis on the deregulation, the privatization, but also using this time to push a lot of so-called supply side reforms that are not actually going to work. I've already talked about how deregulating labor doesn't work. We know that environment now is going to be badly damaged because the new Environmental Audit Assessment Act that they are trying to bring out, it's terrible. It will allow retrospective justification of everything. You don't even need to take prior permission and prior audit clearance and everything. You are allowed to pollute, to destroy, to do all kinds of terrible environmental things with massive human consequences. Let's not forget, it's not just that it's bad for nature, it has human consequences. It adds to pollution that people die of. People have major illnesses that they die of because of atmospheric pollution. It adds to water being contaminated, which again people get ill and die from. It leads to industrial accidents. Look at Tamil Nadu, where every few months there is a major industrial accident that kills lots of people because of these lax regulations and lax protection of these basic environmental standards. So it has really bad human consequences. And of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that the economy revives. Because if you know that this is a country where there are all these things that can keep happening, foreign investors are also a little more cautious. They also say, well, why should we come if, the factory next to us might explode and release all kinds of terrible chemicals that will kill people and kill my workers and so on. So there's a real stupidity to this. But meanwhile, the bailouts to large capital are going on at a massive rate. These do not get talked about. These are all, presented as part of an overall package. But in fact, what's happening is that the cronies are raking it in. The cronies are getting massive benefits in taxes, in subsidies, in all kinds of, and in very cheap loans. Some of the biggest companies in India, Ambani, Adani, etc., they are being allowed to borrow from the Reserve Bank at the repo rate, 4.3%. State governments are not allowed to borrow at this rate. Kerala government today is issuing bonds at 9%. Can you imagine? Why can't you allow state governments to borrow from the RBI at the same rate that you are giving to your cronies? So you see, it's these things which are being played out and which will benefit some people and some companies, but the rest of the country and the rest of the economy will suffer. There is, of course, a massive caste, class, and gender bias to a lot of these measures. We can talk about it in the questions. If you want, I can talk about that. I want to talk a little bit about the digital divide because this is becoming more and more important, and I think it's going to become a big issue in the next few months. There's a big shift to online payment because of the fact that people are now distrustful of handling cash. They think it might carry the disease and all kinds of things like that. But there's also a tendency more and more to shift more activity digital. Now, in some cases, you can do this. A lot of office work, even some writing work, journalistic work, a lot of this can be done digital. But teaching, for example, which is now moving across India, is moving to a digital mode. It's not good enough. I can tell you, I've done it. I have been trying to give Zoom lectures to my students for the last 3 months. And I can tell you, because in JNU, we have students from all over the country and many from very, very different backgrounds. I had a class of 94. Maximum 35 to 40 people could attend a class. Many of them just did not have connectivity. Many of them don't have a laptop. They have maybe one cell phone, but then you don't have enough signal. Data is very expensive, even to download it later. It's not something you can easily do. Even those who could download it, sometimes they couldn't get video, they could only get audio, they would not see the graphs, they could not download the teaching material, they were not able to ask the questions. What we are doing is we're adding to the exclusion of people who come from more difficult and marginal backgrounds. Many of my students who got to go home, they are now forced to help in their family farms or small enterprises. The women students inevitably have to do housework. They are all engaged in things which make it very difficult to study in the way that they did. This is not true of middle class students who can sit in their homes and have internet and have access and can do the teaching in this way. But as I said, for more than 60% of our students, there's a lot of inability to benefit from this teaching. This is actually a very, very deep concern because the more we shift teaching online, and now we're doing this for schools, we're doing it at every level, we are depriving first generation learners for sure, but we're depriving people who don't have all of these things that people take for granted in online learning, in terms of internet access, reasonable ability to look at a screen for a long period of time, connectivity, etc., etc. And that you can pay for all of these things. So what we're adding to now is a major, major digital divide, which is going to get much worse and which is going to reduce equity and it's going to reduce inclusion in our system. And I think that's very sad. And it's adding to the caste and gender bias. Final 2 points I want to make, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. This government has used this period. As I said, it didn't actually use the lockdown for improving health conditions or making sure we had enough of the basic testing capacity and so on. We still have lower testing than many countries at much lower levels of development. So like Kenya and so on. So, there's really no excuse for the fact that we have not done it. But what it did do is use this as a means of doing a crackdown on dissent. So all of those who were engaged in peaceful protests, it feels like a lifetime ago, but it's only a few months ago, that the entire country was seeing an eruption of peaceful protest against the CAA, the Citizenship Amendment Act, and against a lot of other policies of the government. Everyone who's involved in many parts of the country are being taken up, locked up, terrorized, and the number of arrests and throwing people into prisons where COVID-19 infections are spreading at a dramatic rate. And the cruelty of a system that is refusing that is letting out, prisoners who are guilty of murder, rape, etc., but is throwing in peaceful dissenters. That is something that it's remarkable, but it's really something that the government has used to its full advantage. So, this is a pandemic that the government has seized, not to actually somehow help the country to cope and help its population to deal with it, but to impose its own authority and will on a population and prevent and suppress any dissent. Finally, there's one thing that this pandemic should have exposed very, very clearly, and that is the huge importance of care work. It's something that we have neglected in India. We have one of the worst records in terms of health. 1% of GDP is spent, out of which the central government spends only 0.3% of GDP on health. It is one of the lowest and most shame-making indicators that we have. And yet, this government has not actually used this period to improve the conditions of care workers. Our frontline care workers, Anganwadi workers and Ashas, in most parts of the country, I know it's different in Telangana and in Andhra Pradesh, where they are now paid 10,000 a month in Telangana and something similar, slightly lower in Andhra Pradesh. But in large parts of India, Anganwadi workers, health workers, Ashas, they still get 1/3 or 1/4 of the minimum wage at most. Maybe if they're lucky, they will get 2,000, 3,000. In Bihar, they're getting 2,000, and so on. And even that has not been coming. These are the frontline workers now. They are the ones who have to go and deal with people. They're the ones exposing themselves to the infection. They are not given protective equipment. They are not given their wages. We have had strikes in Ahmedabad, in Surat, in Delhi, of doctors and nurses who have not been paid wages for 3 months during the pandemic. In Maharashtra, Anganwadi workers were not paid because the state government said we don't have money. And it's true, they don't have money for the reasons that I have outlined. Okay? But what has happened is that exactly the crisis that should have made everybody realize how important care work is the one that has massively devalued care workers even more. So we will, bajao thali and jalao diya, etc. for them. But we will not actually make sure that they get minimum protection at work and that they get their wages even, or that their wages are increased to something which is a minimal, decent living wage. This is not a problem in Andhra, but I assure you, it's a huge problem in the rest of the country. Okay, I've talked, I think, for too long because I did want to leave some time for questions, but let me stop here. Thank you.
Those who have been following the discussion are invited to raise any questions or issues.
Sir, Ramana Garu, I am Ramnachalam. Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
One question.
Go ahead, Ramnachalam Garu.
One question has come to me that, Madam, can you hear me? The question is.
Yes, I can.
Ghosh, are you able to hear you?
Yeah. Okay. The question is, in this Corona time, is it possible to create employment? Is it possible to create for employment? How it is possible, what steps have the government has to take? This is the one question.
Okay.
And adding to that, government package. Uh, yeah, another question.
Yeah.
How is possible and prime banks performance
which banks?
in your opinion? Prime banks, that means prime banks means State Bank of India, like that, big banks.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yes. What is the question about?
In your opinion?
Yeah.
Question is, how is public and how is public and private banks performance? That is the question. In your opinion, are there fragile signs in the banking system? That is the one question. Deliberately done by Modi government. Only question: how late encounter? That is the question. Is like that.
Yeah, I got the question. Yes. How do we counter it?
How late?
Yes. How do we counter it? Yes, I can see the question.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. That is that.
Okay.
Maybe that one.
Okay.
These two questions I have received, madam.
And privatization of the Indian Railways.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right. Thank you. Thank you for these questions. And I want to take the first one first. It's very important and it's a very good question. And I should have talked about it earlier. You know, it's true that in a period of pandemic, and especially with these physical distancing norms and so on, it's much more difficult to create employment. It's not just that you spend money and automatically there's a multiplier. You have to spend the money in ways that recognize the new realities. Because this is an attack on both supply and demand, right? You cannot produce in the same conditions that you could before. Whether you are producing in a factory or you're producing a service, you have to maintain all kinds of rules. You cannot have the same number of workers in a room. You cannot make them work in the same way. So the policies have to recognize that. So that is why one of the proposals we had suggested is that the government should have a special scheme for micro, small, and medium enterprises. It's very, very difficult for them to function with all of these norms. So their costs are going to go up. And so it will be hard for them to remain competitive. How do we enable them to remain competitive? So we had suggested that we should expand the number of days in the employment guarantee, as I said, from 100 to 200 days per household, and ideally for every adult, not for per household, but for every adult, 200 days. Use some of these workers, allow them to work in the MSMEs. And so it becomes a wage subsidy for the MSME. The MSME can pay their workers a little more than the wage rate under the employment guarantee, but they will get a subsidy to the extent that they are covered by the NRG. And this will enable many MSMEs to survive, which will otherwise go under, which will actually not be in a position to function at all. So this is something which you could also do in urban areas. If you put in an urban guarantee, we have at the moment an urban guarantee in Kerala. Jharkhand is about to start it. These will be very small to begin with. But even if you do it in rural areas, we have many rural MSMEs. This will be one way of generating private employment, and that will enable them to survive. After this period of crisis, then you can actually remove that and allow them to function on their own. That's one of the ways. There are, of course, a number of other ways. I think it's also important to remember, I think Professor Ramana mentioned it also in his opening remarks, that you have to have some notion of industrial policy and planning. It's not going to happen that you just say, okay, we spend money or we do something and private sector will do everything on its own. Because you have to coordinate supply. You have to make sure that essential items, essential inputs are also produced. So you need a bit of coordination and you need some thinking ahead. Now, what is coordination and thinking ahead? It is planning. Unfortunately, the Modi government doesn't like planning, but that's really what is essential right now to enable this economy to address both supply and demand problems. Are there fragile signs in the banking system? Of course. And these fragile signs were there before the crisis. Professor Ramanna pointed out that before the pandemic, our economy was in a very bad shape. And banking was a very large part of that, saddled with very, very large levels of bad loans, most of which were taken by the big corporations, and basically not in a position to actually be lending more. Now they've been hit by this worst thing. And yes, there is a real threat of bank failures as well. There's no question about that. Because it's not this moratorium, it's kicking the can down the road, but it's not even just kicking the can, it's kicking a can that gets bigger and bigger. Because what does a moratorium on interest do? It's not a standstill. It doesn't say you don't pay interest for 3 months. It says you don't pay it now, but that interest will get into your overall loan and get compounded. So 3 months from now, you will have to pay even more interest. That doesn't solve the problem. 3 months from now, how many borrowers are in a position to repay? Very few. So it's not going to work. So in fact, we need much more decisive steps to restructure loans, to declare a complete standstill on interest over this period, not just a moratorium, and to actually refinance a lot of these banks, especially the public sector banks, for them to survive. And this runs also to the privatization issue. Railways, public sector were both mentioned. Yes, this is a government that has no other ideas but to just sell off the family silver in a time of crisis. They don't, and yet this will actually mean in the medium term longer run losses for the government and a worse condition for the economy. We have Navratnas that could have rise to the occasion, that can become the models for other industries. We have a bunch of other, the railways could be modernized. They have been begging for just investment on the tracks for 8 years now. They are begging for proper investment in the railway tracks. For more, all of these things can be done if you actually put your mind to making sure that we have a vibrant sector, instead of just trying to sell it off, which is the worst possible thing to do, and which is counterproductive even from the point of view of creating a strong, vibrant, dynamic economy. Professor Ramanna mentioned China. Unfortunately, China has very strong, powerful public sector companies. We are giving up on ours. How do we counter all of this? Final question. And unfortunately, that is the tough one, because they are really, as I said, cutting down on dissent. They are cracking down on people in every kind of way. They're now shameless. We will do whatever we want. We will do as much corruption as we want. We will not spend any money that people need. And if you dare mention any of this, if you report on this, if you criticize this, if you even tweet on this, we will come down on you and prevent you. This is the way they are functioning. I think that this, it does succeed in terrorizing people and preventing them, but only for so long. I don't think this can continue for long. I think it's important for us to be part of a movement that makes people aware of what is really happening. Because, the way the mainstream media is, it will not tell you any of the things I told you already. Even in this 1 hour, you will not find this on any mainstream TV channel or even in the newspapers. We need to put these messages out there much more in the public domain. And sooner or later, I believe, people also will realize that they have to make a change. Thank you.
Madam, another question is here.
Can you put it? I can see.
Madam, can I ask?
Yeah.
Yeah. Will the real retail marketing recover in post-pandemic situation, withstanding the present online marketing? Madam, I am able.
Yes, I've understood it. I've understood.
Okay.
This is again, it's a difficult question.
Because, another question.
Okay, quickly, because I think the time is up. Yeah. Go ahead. What is the other question?
Another question is, deliberately these done by Modi government, these policies, about these policies, deliberately done by the Modi government. Only question, how we counter it. Some
I've
of the
already
friend asked that question.
Yeah, thank you.
And,
I have already answered. I have already answered the second question. If you had listened to me, you would know I have already answered that second question. Okay. On the question of on the question of digital marketing versus retail marketing, this is a real problem. This was going to be a problem anyway. It was already a tendency, and of course we have these big giants now, Walmart and Amazon, who are slugging it out in the Indian marketplace. So it will be a big concern. I think, however, that there are some things that retail marketing can do, which are harder for very large corporations in the Indian context, given the specificity of India and the very diverse niche kinds of markets across. It will be not as easy as it is in some other countries. But there's no doubt that this is a very, very major threat. And definitely retail marketing will be affected, since that is a very large employer. It's the second largest employer in the country. That is a major concern also. Yes.
What about price rise, especially petrol?
The petroleum price rise is really the petroleum price rise is